Greetings YouTube, Remarkable Republican here once again to bring you the truth with truth-flavored bias. My initial plan was to watch episode 9 early and then do a full review of that movie, but since I was late to see the movie and everyone else has already posted their reviews, I figured I'll continue to think about what the movie meant and then have a full review later. Until then, however, I thought that it would be more productive to talk about Sheev Palpatine, the character whose arc has now been fully completed. He is a character who was at the center of the Skywalker saga from episode 1 all the way through to episode 9. If we view his performance as a whole, it is impossible to come to any other conclusion but that Sheev Palpatine was in fact the intergalactic bullqueer of the unnamed galaxy that Star Wars takes place in. So, before we go any further, let's define our terms. What is a bullqueer? The term bullqueer came from the movie Shawshank Redemption. The term means a gay man who forces himself on others. And while the bull part of bullqueer would seem to imply that a bullqueer must always employ force, that's not necessarily the case. Now, force is certainly one of the tactics that a bullqueer can employ. However, bullqueers can use the entire range of homosexual tactics. And the reason why the term comes from the movie Shawshank Redemption is because it's set in a prison, and that is where bullqueers are most common. However, Sheev Palpatine was bullqueer over an entire galaxy. We could even think of the entire galaxy as a kind of prison if we're going to stretch this metaphor to its natural conclusion. Sheev Palpatine is a bullqueer in both a literal and a metaphorical sense, and he behaves that way in all 9 films. Sometimes he's more explicitly bullqueerish than others, depending on his relative strength at the time. Palpatine also employs much more traditional homosexual tactics at various points in the films, and he also engages in ruses that rely upon manipulation and deceit, something that is very common among homosexuals. Several years ago, I made a video about Tywin Lannister, the apex homosexual of the Game of Thrones universe. The difference between a bullqueer like Palpatine and an apex homosexual is that a bullqueer is explicitly in charge and has all of the power, whereas an apex homosexual is someone who never emerges from behind the scenes but still basically controls things. It's a distinction, and I think it makes a real difference. However, they are quite related, and of course Palpatine is a great deal more powerful than Tywin Lannister, and not just because he has lasers and force abilities. Let us begin at the beginning of the Sheev Palpatine story. When we meet Sheev Palpatine in Phantom Menace, he is a senator from Naboo. He wants to rise to supreme power in the Senate, but he is not the senior senator. He decides to orchestrate a crisis without risking anything, something that will make him look good and give him an opportunity to shine, since he is, of course, able to resolve the crisis anytime he wants, since he caused it in the first place. He personally risks nothing in doing this, and that is something that is a homosexual trait, requiring others to bear the brunt while you yourself do nothing. His apprentice, Darth Maul, ends up paying for Palpatine's rise with his life, and his home planet Naboo suffers an invasion and blockade from the Trade Federation. The person who gains is the brave Senator Palpatine, who struggles against this and rails against the ineffectiveness of his Chancellor in the Senate. At this time, Palpatine also takes a very creepy interest in a young Anakin Skywalker who's about 11 or 12 years old. And while this should be setting off alarm bells in the minds of Jedi Masters, they seem to allow this implied pedophilia because they're afraid of Palpatine now that he is the Supreme Chancellor. They feel like they have to allow him some kind of executive privilege, and they're willing to sacrifice this boy. I think in a way, if you read Phantom Menace in that light, it becomes clear that the film makes you ask yourself whether or not the Senate and the Jedi deserve to continue to exist. And I think in that way, Phantom Menace is actually a very balanced film about the dark side and the light. If we fast forward 10 years to Attack of the Clones, Sheev Palpatine has served as Supreme Chancellor throughout that entire period. That was apparently highly unusual for the Galactic Senate. Any kind of representative government has to have a sharing of power and things like term limits to really work. However, Palpatine was in office that entire time, and I imagine people had to start asking themselves why he was allowed to hold power that long. During this time, Palpatine often attended the opera, and he would go with attendants who had goat heads. Goat heads in Norse mythology are a sign of horniness, and this is something that shows that Palpatine most likely was having orgies with these goat men after attending the opera. The opera itself is a little bit on the gay side, and being attended by goat men is very gay as well. Palpatine continued to demonstrate a strong and unnatural interest in a teenage Anakin Skywalker, and continued to direct his development by intervening on Anakin's behalf. During this time, Palpatine also uses homosexual passive aggression by using a ruse to create a clone army posing as a Jedi, and then he starts a civil war between the Separatist and the Republic. This enables him to buy this army that he secretly ordered and have an army that's completely loyal to himself. He then is voted more powers, emergency powers, due to a proposal by Jar Jar Binks, who has no idea what he's doing. Palpatine is effectively mocking Jar Jar Binks by allowing his fellow Naboo resident to vote him these powers that he will then use to most likely kill Jar Jar and wipe out his people. Out of the 9 Star Wars films, it is always the third addition to each trilogy which shows Palpatine at his most bullqueer. And Revenge of the Sith is arguably the most bullqueer of all of the various performances of Sheev Palpatine. During this movie, he repeats his selfish sacrifice of Darth Maul by sacrificing both Count Dooku and General Grievous. These were his apprentices, and they ended up sacrificing everything so that Palpatine could gain something. This is very typical of how the homosexual operates. He then emotionally manipulates Anakin to drive him to the dark side. He helps to drive all of Anakin's fears that Padme will die. He understands that there is a such thing as heterosexual romantic love, and what he does is to drive that feeling in order to get Anakin to act foolishly. And of course, this plan ends up working. He also offers Anakin a way out. So this is a kind of bullqueer move because it's basically an implied threat or a kind of extortion. If you don't do what I say and come to the dark side, your beloved wife and child will die. During this time, Palpatine also hoodwinks the Jedi Council by using various mind tricks to cloud the thinking of even people like Master Yoda. When he's finally confronted by the Jedi, Palpatine turns out to not be as good with the lightsaber as he thought. One of Palpatine's weaknesses is that he is not all that great in hand-to-hand combat. He's more of a Force thinker and lightning guy. So Mace Windu has him dead to rights. So in order to save himself, Palpatine guilt trips Anakin into helping him. Anakin, of course, saves him in order so he can then save Padme using the tricks that Palpatine will hopefully teach him. So now Anakin becomes his apprentice, and then when Palpatine wants to wipe out the Jedi, he turns to Anakin and his clone troopers and does none of the dirty work himself. Sure, he fights a little duel with Yoda, but Yoda's 900 years old. That's not the same as having to fight someone like Obi-Wan Kenobi or one of the other Jedi who are in their prime. He then goes before the Senate and presents a false persecution narrative in order to claim additional powers. This is something that is a well-known tactic of homosexuals the world over. So, this was his master performance as a bullqueer. And it will get even worse because if we think about the intervening years between Episode 3 and Episode 4, we see that Palpatine never taught Anakin these moves that he claims to have to be able to revive people or save them from death. But then we learn later in episode 9 that Palpatine had this skill all along. I don't want to telescope this too much, but just to see how much Palpatine did to make Darth Vader his bitch. During the events of Star Wars A New Hope, episode 4, this is about 20 years later, Palpatine is well established as Emperor, and he decides to remain in the background, but he does have a new toy called the Death Star, which can destroy entire planets. It's a large space station the size of a moon, and it can just be employed in the orbit of a planet, can charge up and then blast it out of existence. Rather than taking credit for this, Palpatine instead chooses to remain on the capital planet of Coruscant and then let Darth Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin go around and blow up planets, so it looks like it's Darth Vader acting in this evil way rather than himself. Palpatine is hungry for credit and he craves the applause. When he had a feud with Senator Organa, who then revolted against him, rather than hunting down and killing the senator, Palpatine instead decides to destroy the senator's home planet of Alderaan to send a message. And that is a classic bull-queer move. It's classic escalation. And it's also the ultimate fuck you. So they were political rivals, and then Palpatine effectively whipped out his dick and forced himself on all of Senator Organa's people. The next film, and coincidentally the worst film in the Star Wars franchise, Empire Strikes Back. During this film, Palpatine really starts to use more of his passive-aggressive homosexual techniques. He puts Darth Vader in an uncomfortable position of having to choose between betraying himself, the Emperor, someone who he still needs to learn from, and killing his own son, Luke Skywalker. There can only be two among the Sith, so either Darth Vader will have to turn Luke and then try to defeat Palpatine, thus giving up on ever learning Palpatine's secrets, or else he will have to kill his own son and then keep trying to learn all of these techniques that Palpatine keeps withholding. It's a lose-lose situation for Vader, and we can see why he's so frustrated throughout this movie. Palpatine then arranges to set up a trap at Cloud City, and this forces Lando Calrissian to betray his old friend Han Solo. So this is another example of homosexual emotional manipulation. He then compromises the law and order that his empire had worked so hard to establish in order to hire the outlaw Jabba the Hutt in order to use Jabba the Hutt against his enemies. Jabba the Hutt is effectively just a speed bump in the way of Luke Skywalker and his party. So this was not necessary at all. Palpatine had the power to simply crush Luke, but he chose not to. And the reason is because he was behaving as a bullqueer. Return of the Jedi ended the original trilogy, and it should come as no surprise that since it is the end of the trilogy, this is where we see Sheev Palpatine at his most bullqueer. This is where he hits peak bullqueer. Once again, not quite the same peak he had in Revenge of the Sith, but pretty close. Throughout the film, he emotionally manipulates Darth Vader through a combination of threats and reminders that Luke is in fact his son. At Endor, Palpatine then sets the ultimate trap, no pun intended. I'm sure that in his younger years, Palpatine set many a trap for many a man, but it was at Endor where he set his greatest trap in motion by having a mass-scale space ambush. During the fight in the throne room, he manipulates both Luke and Vader as he tries to get them to do his bidding. He wants Luke to kill his father and replace him as the new right hand of the Empire, his new boy toy. On the other hand, he wants to make Vader work harder for his affection. He has had this pederastic relationship with Vader for many years, and like any romantic relationship, it does grow stale after a time. So he's emotionally manipulating them, and he's not really going to offer either of them much. What he's doing emotionally in this scene is very much worthy of the movie Mean Girls. This is extraordinarily gay stuff. Later, of course, Darth Vader wises up and kills him, or at least we thought he was killed. But this was really Palpatine at his peak. He came very close to pulling this off in the most ridiculous means possible by just emotionally manipulating two people without fighting them. And it's really a testament to how strong of a bull queer he was that he was able to get that far doing so little. Palpatine survived Return of the Jedi, and then he retreated into the unknown regions of space to the Sith home planet, where he slowly recuperated and rebuilt his forces. During this time, he was not idle, however. He created a clone named Snoke who had force powers. He created a bunch of them, but then released the one named Snoke. And Snoke went about setting up a First Order that would challenge the Republic and set up a military apparatus that Palpatine could then take over and use to reconquer the galaxy. Meanwhile, he kept up his obsession with destroying planets and created a whole fleet of ships which had super weapons on them that could do what the Death Star did. During this time, he also manipulates Kylo Ren, formerly known as Ben Solo, by faking the voice of Ben's grandfather Darth Vader, thus setting another trap and once again playing into the emotional vulnerability of a confused young person. This is kind of a pederasty by proxy. What he's doing in this case is more like posing as someone on a chat room in order to seduce someone rather than seducing in person, which is what he had done with a young Anakin Skywalker. The First Order ends up destroying some core worlds using the Starkiller base, and this of course weakens the galaxy. Normally, if you want to rule something, you don't want to weaken it before you rule it, just like you wouldn't want to take a sledgehammer to a table before you buy it. But Palpatine's only goal is to get power, unlimited power, as he famously said in Revenge of the Sith. And the ends always justify the means. If the galaxy has to be weaker for him to control it, that's fine. And this kind of super desperation, lack of planning ahead, this kind of emotional rage, once again, this is a characteristic of homosexuality. In The Last Jedi, we learn a lot of backstory about Sheev Palpatine. In the past, he had worked to undermine what would have been the new Jedi Order led by Luke Skywalker. What he did was send images and bad feelings through the Force to Luke and Kylo Ren in order to turn them against each other. He even got Luke to nearly murder his own nephew, and that's what finally sent Ben Solo completely over the edge and made him become Kylo Ren. Kylo Ren was then recruited by Snoke, who of course was just a puppet for Palpatine, and that was a plot that had been working in the years between Return of the Jedi and Force Awakens. During the intervening years, Luke was effectively shamed into exile for having failed his nephew and his other students so horribly, and what it amounts to is that by being shamed in that way, Luke was effectively deplatformed. And if we know anything about the gay community on the internet, it's that their favorite thing to do is deplatform people who critique them. So this is Sheev Palpatine effectively being the apex homosexual. How does he become the bull queer, however? How does he take that extra step? Well, he then goes on to create Force Skype between Rey and Kylo Ren, which is apparently a new ability that he developed. And he creates a love match between two people who had only ever encountered each other very briefly. And he creates this romantic love match because he knows that heterosexual love can be very strong when it's romantic and that it can cloud someone's feelings. And since Kylo and Rey are related, most likely, well, this also would lead to incest. We know that Rey is his granddaughter, and Kylo is the grandson of someone that Palpatine may or may not have created using his own sperm. So, this is just all levels of perversion, and it's something that Palpatine no doubt took great pleasure in orchestrating. Finally, we turn to The Rise of Skywalker, the conclusion of the Skywalker saga. When we look at the opening credits and we think about how Palpatine announced himself to the galaxy, this was very much in the style of a dramatic coming out statement. Just like a kind of tweet from some celebrity who's finally come out of the closet after years of faking being a heterosexual. Throughout the film, what Palpatine does is get back to classic basic manipulation. He is greatly weakened after Return of the Jedi. His body is really falling apart. We see that his fingers are partially melted from falling into that reactor core. And he, of course, by this point is well over 100 years old. He was already in his 60s in the events of the prequel trilogy, so by this point he must be about 110, 120 years old, something like that. And he basically emotionally manipulates the two major Force users in the movie, Kylo Ren and Rey, based on the things they want the most. With Kylo Ren, the thing he wants the most is power and respect. He wants to be the new Darth Vader, and who better to give him that satisfaction, who better to name him that than the guy who trained Darth Vader, Darth Vader's former mentor, Sheev Palpatine. When it comes to Rey, she's looking for her parents, and Sheev Palpatine knows that he is her grandfather and that he can use this to control her. It's also revealed at one point that Sheev is very much jealous of his granddaughter's body and wants to take it over and then be her. This is very much in line with gay men being jealous of how women get more attention from men than they ever can. So that is going on there. Later, he once again demonstrates the super selfishness of the homosexual by greedily stealing the life force of his two young descendants, his grandson and his granddaughter, in order to extend his own life. This is enough to give him maybe 20 years back at the expense of two people who could live for several more decades each. So, that is why Sheev Palpatine is the bull queer of the galaxy. He put his own needs above everyone else, and he did anything he had to do to promote his own power, whether that was destroying half the galaxy or killing his own grandchildren and harvesting their life force after allowing them to grow up and achieve their own personhood. So, that is the whole story of Sheev Palpatine. I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with a truth-flavored bias yet again. And I'm looking forward to making more videos on Star Wars in 2019.